Facebook has a lot to say about Europe's new data privacy rules. Daphne Laprince-Ronguet for ZDNet here with me to talk a little bit more about this. Daphne, what's going on with the new rules here?
Yes, so the EU is at the moment tightening the rules around the transfer of personal data outside of the EU and particularly to the US. And so what Facebook did is they commissioned a report to economists to find out what would happen if the transfer of personal data outside of the EU to third parties was completely suspended. So it's a hypothetical scenario, but they asked economists to sort of quantify the economic impact that this could have if it were to happen. And so they looked at various different sectors. It's obviously impossible to look at all the sectors, but they picked 4 different sectors: telecommunications, digital payments, outsourcing of certain business tasks, and pharmaceuticals and healthcare in general. And so obviously what they found is that if it was to become near impossible, or if there was a ban on the transfer of personal data outside of the EU, it could come at a huge economic cost. If we take the telecoms industry, for example, it can mean that things like international roaming could come to an end because it involves the exchange of personal data about EU citizens from their home network to the network they are visiting. So if this was suspended, it would mean that EU citizens would need to suddenly buy pay-as-you-go cards when they went traveling, and it could come at an extra several billions of dollars worth of extra traveling costs every year for EU citizens. Similarly, if EU citizens were to stop using digital wallets like Apple Pay, Google Pay, PayPal, because they need to send their data back to the US in order to use those digital wallets, this could mean that up to almost $700 million worth of transaction could be lost every day. So again, a huge cost. In the pharmaceuticals industry, it's easy to see why if we weren't able to exchange the medical personal data, sensitive data of EU citizens between different pharmaceutical industries, this could lead to huge delays in drug development, more costs in drug development, and so again, come at a huge economic and in this case, even social impact for EU citizens and business. So the sort of conclusion to that report is in this hypothetical scenario where the transfer of personal data outside of the EU were to be suspended, this could come at a huge economic cost, it could come at a huge social cost, and ultimately be rather detrimental to EU citizens and businesses.
All right, and Daphne, I guess, the big question that many people are talking about and pondering is, the reasons behind, the EU's move here and the things that they're looking to do.
Yes, no, that's the key question. Obviously, if and it doesn't come out of nowhere. Recently, the EU has ruled that the mechanism that existed to transfer personal data between the EU and the US, which was called the Privacy Shield, was invalid, and it came in a decision called Schrems II, named after a lawyer, an Austrian lawyer called Maximilian Schrems, who years ago brought to the European Court's attention the fact that his data that he was submitting to Facebook was then sent to the US, where the national surveillance laws mean that the US government can actually snoop on the personal data that is being processed in the US, even if it is the personal data of EU citizens. So after this observation was made by Max Schrems, there have been years of deliberation about whether personal data should be sent freely or as freely as it was before to the US. And inevitably, a year ago, the EU courts ruled that it shouldn't, that the national laws in the US were not up to European standards when it came to privacy protection, and therefore that the personal data of EU citizens should not freely flow between the EU and the US anymore. Instead, what companies have to do now is implement individual contracts for each data transfer. They're called standard contractual clauses. They're a bit more complicated to put in place, but they are made for each data transfer to make sure that the level of protection in the US will be equal to the level of protection in the EU. But even those SCCs, according to courts, can sometimes be insufficient if they mean that the government can still snoop on European citizens' data once that data is in the US. So what Facebook did in commissioning that report is they said, if this is the new normal, if this is the way that the EU courts are going to deal with transatlantic data transfers, what does that mean for wider transfers? If it means that SCCs can be insufficient, Does it mean that in some cases with other third-party countries, these might be insufficient too? Does it mean that there will be more obstacles to the transfer of personal data outside of the EU? And inevitably, does it mean that it is possible to think that one day the transfer of personal data outside of the EU would become invalid, would become unlawful?
All right, and Daphne, certainly so many layers to this and many different ways that people and companies are being impacted. Those digital advertisers, significantly being impacted here.
Yes, and interestingly, it's not part of the report. The report looks at various different industries that might be affected by a potential ban, but it seems to be sort of missing the point of the Schrems II ruling, which is really about European citizens sending their data, sometimes unknowingly via platforms like Facebook, to the US, where their data might be snooped on by the US government for no, in exchange for no direct service or direct benefit to EU consumers. The reason that Facebook needs to bring this data back to the US is obviously for digital advertising, for targeted advertising, which doesn't represent, at least according to some data experts, doesn't represent a direct benefit to EU consumers. This is not the case of international roaming, where there is a clear benefit, there is a clear service. It's not the case of a digital wallet like Apple Pay or Google Pay, where again, there is a clear service. So the point is that EU courts are unlikely to be looking at those use cases where there is the delivery of a service that is beneficial to EU consumers. Rather, they're likely to look at use cases like Facebook, where the delivery of the service isn't as clear. And maybe this is what Facebook should have been looking at in this report is there a clear service that can be delivered by Facebook to consumers in exchange for processing their data outside of the EU? And if so, is it worth rethinking the rules in order to be able to do that in a more easy way?
All right, Daphne, thank you. For much more on Daphne's full article, make sure you check it out on ZDNet. Thanks for watching.